African War was also a bad thing for Britain in the sense that, once again, its military overreach, its imperial overreach, was dramatically illustrated. And the impossibility, really, of trying to handle colonial government militarily. So Britain was basically humiliated for 2 years during the course of this war. By the end of the war, there was something like 450,000 British troops over in South Africa, and they were fighting basically a guerrilla war with less than 100,000 African soldiers. And the guerrilla nature of that warfare was really what caught Britain out. There were 3 very famous sieges where British troops were held in Ladysmith, in Mafeking and Kimberley. The reports of those sieges were followed very closely in the British press. And Britain began to use increasingly novel tactics, shall we say, for the conduct of this war. And so to deal with the question of the mobility of the combatants they were fighting, they introduced concentration camps. They introduced camps where they would round up African women and children and men where they were around and put them in concentration camps, sometimes known as refugee camps, to make sure that those people were unable to support Afrikaans fighters. And they did the same also, different camps for the black African population. Now the conditions in these camps became infamous. And they became infamous through the reporting of Emily Hobhouse in the Manchester Guardian and Henry Massingham in the Daily Chronicle. They, first of all, highlighted the fact that these camps existed, and second of all, exposed the very high rates of mortality within them. There were in total something like 34 camps, holding vast numbers of Afrikaans and black Africans. The figures are very difficult and highly contested, but reasonably safe figures is something like 25,000 Afrikaans died and 14,000 black Africans, and they represent about 25 and 10% of the populations of those people held in camps. There's an official commission set up to investigate the conditions in this camp, interestingly headed up by Millicent Fawcett, the leader of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, but it fails basically to quell the criticism. And very famously, the Liberal MP, Henry Campbell Bannerman, asked questions about these camps in the House of Commons and said that equated them to the use of methods of barbarism. How come the British Empire is relying on these barbaric methods when it's meant to be a force of good? Far from civilizing, it is indeed creating barbaric conditions. Okay, I think I can do this. I still have quite a lot of stuff to get through, so I'm not going to ask you 4 questions, I'm afraid. Okay, so the point there was basically that the empire becomes politically very contentious and that the old idea of it as being a benevolent and civilizing force becomes increasingly questioned. Now, you'll know already from the lecture on Tuesday that there is growing anxiety, not just about the scale of poverty in Britain, but the racial health of the population as a whole. And you must pinch yourself and remember that the beginning of the 19th century is one where the preoccupation is about overpopulation. The question for Malthus was, how could populations be sustained? By the late 19th century, that question had basically disappeared. And now the issue was one of how can we handle declining fertility? Why is the population not growing as rapidly as it once was? And more importantly, why are the wrong type of people reproducing? Why is it the working poor that are having more children than the respectable classes? And what are the consequences of that? It was, of course, in these conditions that you have the growth of social Darwinism and eventually of eugenics. Francis Galton is the person who basically begins the science of eugenics in the 1880s, developing a whole series of types of biometric measures to try and figure out how it is that one could perfect the racial health of a population. And I want to make it very clear to you that this concern with the racial health of the population and this interest in eugenics was not something that only nutters at the far right of the political spectrum were interested in. These were ideas that were infused people across all political parties. So the Pankhurst, for instance, Emily Pankhurst, that you'll remember in The Great Scourge, is primarily concerned with racial health. It's true of figures like Sidney and Beatrice Webb in the Fabian movement that becomes part of the Labour Party, and it's true of figures like Balfour and Churchill on the Conservative Party as well. Indeed, such is the concern about the scale of the deteriorating scale of Britain's racial health that a special department, a special commission, is formed in 1904, the Interdepartmental Committee on Physical Deterioration. And that is a hugely important committee because it recommends a whole series of measures that will become part of the platform of the so-called New Liberal Party that is elected in 1906 for a much more interventionist social program that I'll show you in a minute. But this wasn't all about state intervention. It was also about the animation of civil society itself. The question was, how could you raise girls and boys who would be well adapted to ensuring the future racial superiority of the British? Now, for boys, this was all about physical education. It was all about the inculcation of new forms of militarism. And the best example of all here is the Boy Scouts formed by Baden-Powell, who had been one of the heroes of the siege in Ladysmith in the South African War. But the Boy Scouts were by no means alone. There were a whole series of organisations, the Boys Brigade, the Empire Youth Movement, the League of Empire, the British Empire Union. All of these organisations were set up in the last decade of the 19th and the first decade of the 20th century. This idea of an adventurous, masculine, determined male was in many ways wonderfully illustrated in the disaster of Scott's expedition to the Antarctic. Scott became a hero in Britain, not because of his failure, although Britons do like people that fail greatly, but because of the sheer determination that his expedition entailed. But there are also new types of demons as well as new types of heroes. And if you have to have an ideal type of boy or man, so you have to have its antithesis. And it's no coincidence that it's in the decades after 1885 that you have the pathologization, the criminalization of homosexuality. The identification of homosexuality with a particular form of effeminate man that became classically illustrated in the figure of Oscar Wilde. Girls had to be taught, in contrast, how to be good mothers. Girls were thought to be literally the engineers of the race in that sense. If you could teach a girl to be a good mother, she would have strong and healthy children. And one of the recommendations of the Interdepartmental Committee on Physical Deterioration were almost entirely concerned with the welfare of women and children. So it recommended the use of school meals to feed hungry children and to make sure that they were not challenged by their malnutrition. It recommended the medical inspection of children at schools so that the scale of degeneration or the improvement of racial health could be met. It recommended the notification of births so that the state would be immediately aware of all children born, and it introduced the Children's Act of 1909, which outlawed the sale of liquor to children and the practice of overlaying, of having children basically in your bed. It also set up a whole new set of state services like the use of midwives to enable women to have births, health visitors to go and visit women after they've had children, and the introduction of domestic science, or what is called here household economy? No, household home economics, thank you, in the school curriculum. I just don't have time to do this. Sorry, I don't have time to do this. I've got too many other things to talk about. The key point that you need to know here is that Britain's first ever Immigration Act is passed in 1905, restricting who can come into the country. Britain had always thought of itself as the home of liberty, where anyone could come to Britain and be free. In 1905, it introduces an Aliens Act, which is expressly concerned to stop Jewish immigration, because from the 1880s, there had been a flow of poor Jewish immigrants from the pogroms in what we now think of as, or what we once thought of as Eastern Europe and Southern Russia. Jewish immigration, particularly in London, helped catalyse a series of racist responses to it in organisations like the British Brothers League, whose handbill for a meeting you can see here. It's often argued by historians that the Aliens Act is introduced in 1904, 1905 to try and help the Conservative Party hold on to power. Remember, the Conservative Party gets elected in 1900, there's an election in 1906, and here we have a good example of the Conservatives trying to use the patriotism, immigration, empire as a way of shoring up its electoral support. Having said I didn't have time to do it, I just did it. But now I really have to crack on because I have a lot of stuff to get through in the next 20 minutes. This is what I have to cover. Should be easy. Oh, this is mad. So I'm going to talk about the labour movement. I'm going to talk very, very briefly about women's suffrage, and then Ireland again, all too briefly. I've said very little in this class so far about the rise of the labour movement. When I was an undergraduate sitting in chairs like you are now, we were taught that the labour movement basically stretched back into the deep mist of time, and certainly the early 19th century, and sometimes even the late 18th century. And it was hooked to the story of the Industrial Revolution that's happening around that time. I don't think the labour movement really becomes a labour movement in Britain until the late 19th century, and I think it takes two shapes. I think it's about the growth of trade unionism, which had been decriminalised. Remember the Combination Acts in the early 19th, late 19th and late 18th and early 19th century had once criminalised it. But the trade union movement radically changed its shape and form in the late 19th century that gives it a lot more power in collective bargaining and in strike action. And it does so because it reorganises itself by sector, not by skill. Okay, so let me explain what that means. That you would have unions that would, for instance, represent textile workers, not, as in the past, a union representing just spinners or just weavers. Okay? It tried to represent all the workers in that sector. And this is why it's known as new unionism, because it tried to break down the hierarchies of craft and skill differentiation. Well, not break them down, but try and incorporate them in a collective effort. Trade union membership rose very dramatically during this period. It had reached 2 million in 1900 and had doubled to 4 million by 1914, would almost double again by the end of the First World War. And the union movement became increasingly confrontational in its tactics, or rather less adverse to strike action. There were a series of very important strikes in the 1880s, catalysed in large part by the growth of unemployment, of people being laid off work, and of the declining prices, which put the great squeeze on wages for employers. The Maxwell strike in 1888 and the gas and dock workers strike in 1889. This meant, this new articulate, confident trade union movement meant that political parties began to compete to try and represent the so-called labour interests. Everybody wanted to claim that it was the best political vehicle for members of the union movement. And so it's at this point that you have political parties that actually think of themselves as representing this labour interest. The Social Democratic Federation is a good example of that. The Independent Labour Party is a good example of that. But mainly, these various forms of political representation of the labour interest on the left, outside the Liberal Party, came together in this organisation known as the Labour Representation Committee. It was like a coalition, if you like, of left-leaning parties. And yet, the Liberal Party still had a very strong hold. and purchase on these organisations. Thus, the Labour Representation Committee had a pact with the Liberal Party in 1903 where they would not put up, they agreed that there would be the constituencies where they wouldn't compete against each other. And historians would now say that up until the First World War, the Labour Party is basically only strong in very specific local areas. In East London, where the Liberal Party had never been very strong, in Clydeside, in Scotland, and in the West Riding, in the old areas of the wool industry, i.e. the very areas where the Liberal Party had never really had a grip. Many people, of course, felt themselves unrepresented by the trade union movement, and that was particularly true of the unemployed. And so it's no coincidence that you have the first ever hunger march in the world in 1905 by workers who have no other means of articulation. The trade union movement, if you're unemployed, no trade union movement represents you. And so the movements for the unemployed were very important in the decades from 1905 through to the 1930s, and I'll have more to say of those later. So the trade union movement has its own critics within amongst the unemployed. The last thing I want to say here is that there is a dramatic few years of unprecedented large-scale industrial unrest in the years between 1909 and 1912. Some people would say that it had begun in 1907. There was a big railway strike in 1907. There was coal miners went on strike in 1908. But it's really the massive strike by the so-called Great Transportation Strike of 1912 and the strike by dock workers leading up to that that had saw an unprecedented scale of striking and of unprecedented use of force against those on strike. So 4 strikers were shot dead when the police tried to break up a dock strike in Liverpool and in Llanelli in South Wales in 1911. This was unheard of territory. These types of strikes and this scale of strike action was unprecedented. As I said, one of the parties competing to represent the Labour interest was indeed the Liberal Party. And the Liberal Party embraces this philosophy of new liberalism that tries to come to terms with the fact that poverty and labour unrest were a consequence of forces beyond the control of individuals. That individuals were situated in economic relations over which they had very little control. And the real distinction between new liberalism and the liberalism of the Liberal Party that preceded it was that it's supposed to be about the scale of state intervention. Okay? But you know that the liberalism of the 19th century was full of state intervention. Think about the workhouse, think about the Poor Law, think about sanitation acts. The difference here is that in the middle of the 19th century, people who thought of themselves as liberals wanted to use the state to intervene upon those that they thought were not capable of self-government. Okay? So they pick upon those groups of the poor, the ignorant, or the unhealthy, or the unsanitary, etc., etc. New liberalism did something radically different. It wanted to use the state to help people realize their potential for self-government. It's a big, big difference. They wanted the state to help lift people up so they were capable of being able to look after themselves. And at the centrepiece of this action was David Lloyd George, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer, and who devised and implemented the so-called People's Budget in 1909. And the People's Budget was the centrepiece because it raised the revenue for a whole series of new measures. It expanded the scale of income tax. It introduced capital gains tax and death duties up to 25%, and just to show that he was a good liberal, also introduced new duties on alcohol and tobacco. Out of this money came the introduction of the old age pensions in 1909 and the introduction of national insurance in 1911. So the old age pension gave people over 70 5 shillings a week, and there were something like 1 million beneficiaries of that programme. And national insurance provided protection on those who lost their earnings after 15 weeks for illness or unemployment. And it was put together by contributions both by employers and from the state. By 1914, something like 13 million British workers were covered under this programme. Now, the radical nature of this programme was evident by the fact that the House of Lords refused to pass the People's Budget. It refused to pass the People's Budget. And this produced a profound constitutional crisis. That the elected government was trying to pass a very important fiscal measure that was the basis of its social programme, and the unelected House of Lords blocked it. Over the course of 2 years, this produced 2 elections.